This lecture will be examining early Korean-U.S. relations between 1866 and 1910. Historical periodization is very important. Historians often divide different eras in a country's history into periods. And I would argue that, broadly speaking, there are 5 periods that are highly relevant to the relationship between Korea and the United States. So first of all is Korea before 1866. Korea is not going to really have contact with the United States during that time period, but we have to understand some kind of the characteristics of Korea during that time period that will continue on as Korea encounters the United States. The period from 1866 to 1876 we can refer to as a period of resistance to Western contact. That's when there are going to be Westerners, including Americans, who want to open Korea's doors to trade, to missionary activity, to formal diplomatic relations. And during this time period, the Korean government says, no, we don't want that. What changes is in 1876, Japan is able to eventually get Korea to open its doors. We'll talk more about that briefly. And that leads to what we call the open port period, right? The period of open ports when Korea is going to allow foreigners, non-Koreans, to come into its ports in larger numbers to trade and eventually to engage in mission work and that kind of thing. And this period is also marked by imperial competition for influence over Korea. In particular, Russia, China, and Japan will be in competition. And in a sense, that's what leads to this next period when this competition will go from being kind of peaceful, more oriented towards trade, to actual fighting wars, right? There'll be a war in 1894 to 1895 between China and Japan that Japan will win. And then there'll be another war in 1904 to 1905 between Russia and Japan, which Japan will also win. And during that period, in between those years, the Korean government is going to try and undertake a lot of reform. Korean people outside the government will also try and undertake reform. But ultimately, Japan's victories in those wars puts an end to those attempts at reform. And that leads to the next period, the period of colonization, in which Japan will start to colonize Korea, beginning, we can say, in 1905, once it kind of corresponding, paralleling its defeat of Russia, and will end with Korea becoming a formal part of Japan in 1910. So that's kind of the broad periodization, the broad strokes. I'm going to now go into more detail about the important characteristics for us to understand about each one of these periods. One of the basic things we have to understand, of course, is Korea's geography. Korea is mountainous, all right, and you can kind of see that picture on the left. That's particularly rugged mountains for Korea. They're not always that tall and rugged, but if you drive through the countryside, you're going to see mountains everywhere. And there's a Korean saying, beyond the mountains, there are mountains, meaning beyond the difficulties we face now, there'll be more difficulties later on. And it's interesting that they frame that proverb in terms of mountains. And some Koreans will joke that if you were to knock all the mountains flat, like flatten them with a giant hammer, Korea would be the size of China, right? So it's a highly mountainous country. That has impacted Korea because in one sense it made it relatively poor, right? There's not nearly as much arable land in Korea as there are in other places. It also means that it's very difficult to militarily conquer Korea. That will complicate things, for example, during the Korean War. And in a sense, that has allowed the Koreans to have a better chance of maintaining their independence because it's not easy to conquer Korea, especially when you've got an effective government in Korea that is organized around the military, such as you might have today in North Korea. But it's not easy to conquer. And that has laid a role to it maintaining its independence. And at the same time, because it's not particularly wealthy for most of its history, you know, it's like this is a place that would be hard to conquer, but wouldn't give us much wealth. Let's leave it alone. And that's one thing that will help Korea maintain its independence. Korea is also a peninsula. And that's important also to note. That makes it a little bit easier in some ways for Korea to engage with the world around it because it's surrounded by water on 3 sides. At the same time, in a sense, it also can make Korea more vulnerable because there are many different areas from which it can be invaded. And related to that issue of Korea being a peninsula, Korea is really, in a sense, kind of a crossroads for East Asia, right? It borders China today. China has for the last few hundred years has claimed that part of what we sometimes call Manchuria. In any case, Korea is really close to China. and was able to be influenced by China and influence China in return. Likewise, it is also really close to Japan. And this creates kind of a security dilemma for Korea because it's surrounded by these two giants, right? China in its history has been expansionistic. It's been able to conquer large amounts of territory to expand its influence, was never able to completely, though, take over Korea. Similarly, Japan, likewise, was expansionistic and also was not able to take over Korea. So Koreans are in this kind of difficult position. I mean, they do have one big advantage in being mountainous that makes it a little bit harder to take them over, makes it less likely people would want to take them over because it's just not, in a sense, until recently, it wasn't that wealthy of a country. But also it's surrounded by these two very large powers that if they really, really wanted to, right, might be able to take over the country. And at times they almost did. And of course, Japan does annex Korea in 1910 and controls it until 1945. So Koreans really face this serious issue. They're surrounded by these gigantic countries that, if they really, 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 really wanted to, might be able to take over Korea. And like I said, Japan was able to successfully do this for a time. So Koreans were very much interested in security. And that didn't mean having a huge army necessarily. That would be expensive, and Korea could never have as big of an army as, say, China or Japan. Instead, Koreans focused on diplomacy in order to maintain their security. Right? They focused on diplomacy in order to maintain their security. And in particular, of course, their diplomacy with these two countries. Korea emphasized what were called neighborly relations with Japan, which was basically just trying to be friendly with Japan, having the only contact that was the minimal contact necessary to keep Japan happy so Japan would not try and invade. Right? So, for example, Koreans realized that for example, that there were Japanese pirates and that these pirates would sometimes attack Korea. But if Koreans were willing to trade with the Japanese, the number of pirates would decrease. Right? So a lot of times these pirates were not driven by a desire to just go out and kill and steal. They were actually quite poor. And so Koreans would trade with Japan. The Korean government actually allowed the Japanese to come to the port city of Busan in the southeast, which is very close to Japan. The Koreans would actually let the Japanese come and trade there in order to prevent piracy. Not because Koreans thought international trade was good. They didn't really want that many Japanese people there, and they tried to keep it a minimum. They tried to keep the trade as little as possible while still preventing the pirates from attacking. So again, you can see their diplomacy is driven not by a desire for trade, but by a desire for security. We need to trade with the Japanese just enough so that they don't become pirates and attack us. And it's interesting that Koreans were willing to send embassies to visit the Japanese government, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. But they didn't want any Japanese embassies coming to Korea. They never let the Japanese come to Seoul, for example, in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries because they were afraid that the Japanese would use that as an opportunity to spy on them and then use that information to invade, which Japan actually did in the 1590s. So you can see here, Korea's focus is on security, right? Its diplomacy is focused on security. Its policy with China was much different. Korea referred to its policy towards China as serving the great. China was Korea's older brother, and the Koreans in many ways looked up to the Chinese. Now, they didn't want to be part of China and be ruled by the emperor of China. They wanted to maintain their independence, but they looked up to China as an older brother that would protect them. And this worked really well in many respects because Korea, by accepting China as its older brother and accepting Chinese civilization, especially Confucianism, and accepting this role as little brother, China had to respect Korea's territorial integrity, right? Chinese identity was based around this idea of being a big brother, of being benevolent, of protecting weaker nations that had accepted Chinese hegemony in a sense. And so they had to protect the Koreans. So when Japan invaded in the 1590s, China intervened. And that intervention was key to Korea maintaining its independence. And one other thing I want to emphasize, there were no Chinese officials in Korea telling the Koreans what to do. The Koreans had their own money. They had their own calendar. They maintained their own diplomatic positions. They maintained their own army. So they were an independent country. They just accepted China as this older brother, and that worked really well because not only would China not invade, because older brothers in Confucianism aren't allowed to beat up on younger brothers, they're supposed to protect younger brothers, it also meant China would intervene to protect Korea, right? So Koreans had this security issue, and they deal with it successfully through their diplomacy. So Korea has this tension that we have to understand if we're going to study Korea and its relationship with the United States, is that Koreans are willing to accept influence from other countries, but also want to maintain their independence. So accepting Confucian civilization does not mean accepting Chinese rule, right? Koreans wanted to be independent. They asserted their independence in many ways. They were, in fact, an independent country, even as they accepted China as kind of an overlord, older brother. And one way I think, the kind of quickest way I can kind of show this and illustrate this, and this is really important for us to kind of understand, because the relationship between the United States and Korea for many years was very much like the relationship between China and Korea. Whereas the United States would influence Korea, Koreans also wanted to maintain their independence and selectively adopt American influence when it suited them. So to show you how this can kind of go together, in the 15th century, there was a king of Korea called Sejong. And King Sejong is considered like the best king in Korea. He's called King Sejong the Great. Why is he called the Great? Because he's the one that ordered the invention of the Korean alphabet, right? Before this time, Koreans wrote in Chinese. So imagine how difficult that would be, is that, you speak English at home, say, but then if you want to write something down, you have to write it in French. That's kind of what the Koreans had to do. So King Sejong was like, well, this doesn't make sense, and he ordered the development of a Korean alphabet. And Koreans today celebrate this, and I think rightly so, as an important milestone in the development of Korean culture and this Korean sense of identity, and I think that's all correct. What's important, though, to note is that some of the very first texts that Sejong had published in this new language new alphabet, were based on Confucianism, right? So they developed, in a sense, a Korean alphabet in order to allow more people to be influenced by Chinese Confucian civilization. And even though, in a sense, for me to say Chinese Confucian civilization is problematic, because the Koreans are like, well, this is Confucian civilization, it just happens to come from China, and China's really good at it. But you can kind of see in King Sejong this kind of phenomenon I'm trying to talk about. The Koreans will accept foreign influence while also trying to maintain their independence, right? We're going to invent and develop our own alphabet so we can better utilize these foreign ideas of Confucianism, and we've adopted them for so long that even though we recognize they come from China, in a sense they're not really foreign anymore. So we now need to talk about what characterizes the Chosun Dynasty political system. Now, a dynasty, it just refers to a ruling family. So you're going to have the same ruling family governing Korea between 1392 and 1910. Very, very long time. Koreans are very good at stability. Now, you'll notice I have two terms for the word Chosun, Joseon and Chos, and then an O with a diacritical mark N. It's a little confusing because there's two ways of Romanizing Korean. The one on the left is the one that the Korean government, South Korean government, wants you to use. The one on the right is what scholars have traditionally used. I just want to give you one example. I'm going to generally try and follow the one on the left. I think it's just easier for students to use, and it's easier to search on the internet and things like that if you're trying to find information. But do know that there are two systems. Try not to let that confuse you, even though it is confusing. But I'm going to follow the government one in general because I think it's easier. So first of all, one thing that characterizes the Chinese or the Korean political system is it's a Confucian bureaucracy, right? So the government is run by officials who have been trained in Confucian knowledge and Confucian ritual, and they think in Confucian terms. So, for example, they have this understanding that the government is supposed to be kind of a benevolent dictatorship. The government tells people what to do for their own good, and the people should obey and respect and accept that. Right? That's kind of how Confucian bureaucracy works. It's this idea that the government should be benevolent, should exist to run things for the people, but it's not democracy because people don't get to tell you what they want, right? If it makes sense, you've heard of this famous saying, government of the people, for the people, by the people. Koreans would say, the Confucian bureaucracy say, it is government for the people, but it's not of the people or by the people, right? We govern for the good of the people, but we know what's good for them. Korea was also highly influenced by Chinese law, but they would adjust that to Korean custom. And in part for these reasons, because they've accepted Confucianism and Chinese law, Korea had a king, not an emperor. In the Chinese system, there can only be one emperor, one son of heaven. He was in China. The best you could be if you accepted this Chinese system was a king. And Koreans accepted that. They didn't want to try and compete and try and have an emperor. It didn't make sense to them. It would threaten China's security if they tried to say we had an emperor. Now, what's really complex is the dominance of a group called the Yongbon. If you're doing research on this time period, you're going to see this term used. So I need to explain what it is. But the Yongbon is basically a social class in Korea. You could call them gentry. But to be Yongbon, you had to have at some point had a family member who had served as a scholar official in the Confucian bureaucracy. We use scholar officials to emphasize that to be a government official, you also had to be a scholar, right? You had to be a Confucian scholar to become a government official. And if you came from a family that had a history of providing such scholar officials to serve in the government, you were Yongbon, right? You were Yongbon. And what that means essentially is that you were allowed to take the exams that allowed you to become a government official. Now, this is really confusing, and this is what I mean about borrowing things and then changing them. If you've taken my classes before, you know that in China, the exam system was set up so that basically almost any male could take the exams, right? It was a way of bringing in new talent. But in Korea, only the Yongbon, only people who had at one time had served as scholar officials, only they had the right to take the exams. So when you took the exams, you wouldn't just write your name on the test paper. You also had to write the name of like your parents and grandparents, basically. So because they wanted to make sure that you actually had proper Yongbon status. So the exam system in Korea existed to preserve elite power. And as much as possible, the elite tried to keep the system closed. The elite wanted to stay elite. They didn't want anyone else coming in. Now, in many ways, that's not fair, and that's going to lead, in a sense, to some reform efforts later on. But it did lead to a kind of a system that encouraged stability and order. Right? The government and the elite worked together in a way that supported each other. And they had this stable system where people have a place in society and they're kept in that place. And that works really well for bringing stability. And you can see this in the fact that the dynasty lasts for more than 500 years. And I have to emphasize, if you look at other countries during this time period, they have, especially China, Japan, there's like rebellions, there's wars, there's fighting. There's a lot less of that going on in Korea. Right? So Koreans will pursue this kind of system of stability. It will work very well, and it will allow for a large amount of peace in Korea. However, the price of this stability is frustration, especially among people who are educated, but who have been excluded from power for various reasons. For example, you could lose your Yongbon status if you became too poor and couldn't perform Confucian rituals or receive an education. Or in Korea, they were very strict. If your father was Yongbon, but your mother was a secondary wife, so not the first wife, like a concubine, even if she had that legal status, because if you were a wealthy man in Korea, you could have multiple wives. Your son would not be considered Yongbon, neither would your daughter, but the son is the one that they focused on because it's a Confucian system. So there were lots of Koreans who really didn't like this status system because they might have an education similar to the Yongbon. They might have a Yongbon father, but they themselves were not considered Yongbon and so were excluded from the system. So in Korea, you have this system where these elite Yongbon basically kind of control everything to a large extent, and that breeds a kind of resentment, right? And those people who resent the Yongbon, especially people who are poor Yongbon, who would like to have more status, or who are people who are almost Yongbon but not quite there, those are the people who are going to be most interested in reform, right? So you can kind of think about it this way. If you've got, if you're an educated Yongbon who is high up there, you don't want to change the system. But if you're educated and you're one of these lower Yangban, or you're educated and your father is Yangban but your mother's a concubine, you're excluded from the system, you would really like to change that system. And because you're educated and maybe you even have some money, you are more likely to have the ability to change that system. So that's one thing I really want you to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about the people who are going to have contact with, especially with the United States, is that many want to change Korea because they're losers under the old system. And they see a new system as not only being good for Korea, but good for themselves personally. And I use this image to kind of highlight this, right? You've got the Yangban in the back being pulled by a non-Yangban in the front. Now, thus far, I've been focusing on men, but we also need to look at women, because one thing, and of course, a very important part of history is women's history, but also because one thing that a lot of Americans are going to comment on, and a lot of things some Korean women are interested in, is the status of women in Korea and in the United States. So Korea followed Confucianism. Confucianism is a very patriarchal system, focuses a lot on men. Confucius himself, I mean, in the books that he that cover the sayings that are credited with him, basically says, "I don't get women. I don't understand what the heck they're thinking." He says it more politely than that. But there's this kind of patriarchy that sees women as odd, right? And that sees women as, in a sense, needing to be controlled. And what happens is, if you're a Yangban, if you're one of these people who are supposed to be high up there in the system, if you're an elite person who is going to be studying Confucianism so you can pass those exams so you can get a government job, you need to follow Confucianism all the time. And Yangban status, you couldn't really get it if you didn't have it, but you could lose it if you didn't follow correct Confucian morality. So one thing you did if you were a Yangban was that you didn't live in like a single house. You had like a compound with a wall. And ideally, women in your household did not leave the home, right? And they even had their special inner quarters in the house, or I should say in the compound. So you would have like a wall. And inside this walled compound, you would have multiple buildings, and there were separate buildings for women. And those were in the inside of the compound. So it was really hard for the women to even see outside their compound. And if a woman should have to leave her home for some reason in a Confucian household, she should dress as these women are dressed here, right? You'll see that they have pulled up their coats so you can almost see nothing, right? All that's visible is just a little bit of their face. And there was this idea, basically, that men and women should be kept separate, that women should only see either their husband or their male relatives or their children, right? Or maybe their father. Right. The idea was that men and women have separate roles in society. Men and women should be kept apart. And if you bring them together, they'll start basically having orgies. So and then we don't know whose kid is whose, and we don't want that. We got to keep them separate. In Confucianism, it's very important that the ancestor rites that are performed for the ancestors are performed by a son who is directly descended from the ancestor. And you can't do that if you have men and women playing around, because you won't know whose kid is whose. So the problem is all this leads to this kind of patriarchy that really tries to control women, right? Women are meant to be kept inside, kept separate from men as much as possible. And there's this understanding that men are public. Men can be out among other people, can engage in government business. Women are supposed to be at home and separate. And so this becomes a major issue, and this is something the missionaries in particular are concerned about. Especially one thing that's important to note is that there's a lot of American women missionaries in Korea, and they don't much like this system, and they would like to see it changed. Now, one thing we also have to understand, though, is that this morality was only for the wealthy, in a sense. You had to have lots of money to have a compound where you could have separate buildings for the women to live. For most Koreans, even though they understood Confucian morality and might try and practice it as much as possible, they simply couldn't do it, right? For the vast majority of Koreans lived in a single room house, right? Or, maybe had a couple rooms, but they certainly didn't have a walled compound. And they couldn't keep this up. And what's fascinating is, and I have this picture to kind of give you an indication, if you look this up, there's all these pictures of Korean women with their breasts exposed. And if you look at a traditional Korean outfit, and you kind of see it with this woman on the left, you'll know she has a baby on her back, and you can see that around her stomach, there's like, it almost looks like bandages that are wrapped around. Those are what's keeping the baby on her back. And then just above those bandages are her breasts, and she has kind of a short jacket so she could easily expose her breasts to feed the child. And Korean women would often, lower class women would often go around with their breasts exposed so they could easily feed their kids. And this, I highlight this because you can see this kind of difference in morality based on wealth and status, right? Yangban women are expected to like never go out or go out as low as possible and wear all these clothes, whereas lower class women, I mean, they are going to expose their breasts in public and breastfeed in public and so forth. And so you don't have this kind of universal, in a sense, morality. And this is something that bothers, again, the missionaries, right? The missionaries are kind of bothered by this as well. And so they're very concerned with the status of women in Korea. And of course, so are the women of Korea. Whether rich or poor, many of them do not like living in a patriarchal society and would like to see things changed. Now, one thing, if you study Korean history, and I guess all of human history, is powerful people don't generally say, I've got enough power, that's great, I'm just going to stop. No, they say, I want more power, right? And in particular, the Yangban are in competition with each other for the limited number of government positions available. And in addition, they are always afraid of losing their Yangban status, right? If you don't stay wealthy enough to be able to forward Confucian books, if you don't have the money that will allow you to live a life of studying the Confucian books, if you don't have the money to perform Confucian rituals, to build those big compounds like I was talking about, you can lose your status as Yangban. So in general, these Yangban are going to be seeking more power in society, and this usually comes at the expense of the common people, right? So Yangban will try and expand their land as much as possible, right? And who loses their land? Well, common people do. Two other things to note, for example, for many years, Yangban didn't really pay any taxes. Most taxes were paid by the common people of Korea. The Yangban argued that, hey, we need money in order to study, in order to perform these rituals, so we shouldn't be paying taxes. And it wasn't until much later, when they had a really powerful king in Korea who was able to force the Yangban to pay taxes, that they really paid much of any taxes at all. So, and to give you another example, in many ways, Korea was a slave society. Koreans enslaved other Koreans. It depends on the time period, but something like 10 to 30% of Korean people during the Chosun Dynasty could be slaves. And of course, the people who owned these slaves generally were the Yangban. So not only were the Yangban trying to expand and seize the land and property of the common people, they also tried to, in many ways, enslave those same people. And this was a major problem, especially for the government, because slaves don't pay taxes in Korea, right? So what happens is there's this kind of competition between the kings and the people on one side versus the Yangban on the other side, but at the same time, the kings need the Yangban to help them rule. The Yangban are often the ones that kind of run things locally, so the kings can't push the Yangban too far. Now, the strong kings were able to maintain the balance between the common people and the Yangban and keep peace and stability. And between 1755 and 1800, Korea was blessed with a number of strong kings who did a pretty good job. But then between 1801 and 1873, they had a period of very weak kings, with the exception that we're going to be talking about momentarily, a man called the One Goon. They're going to have these kind of weak kings who don't really do a good job of kind of running things. There'll be a lot of corruption, because what ends up happening is, when I say weak kings, a lot of these guys became kings when they were just kids. And when the king is a kid, you have to have a regent who helps the king rule. And these regents were often not interested in ruling in a way that would benefit the whole country. They were interested in benefiting their family. So these regents were often basically corrupt. And this allowed the expansion of Yangban power. You had people who were not thinking, what's the best way to govern the whole country? You had people thinking, what's the best way to take care of my family and my class? So that makes Korea really weak during a time when Western imperialism is expanding. During this time period, then, there's this kind of questioning of the old orthodoxy, right? People start to question society. When the kings are doing a good job ruling, when the common people are doing okay, there's this general feeling like, okay, things are all right. But when you've got, corrupt officials, when you've got Yongbon abusing the common people, there's a feeling that something is wrong. People will start to question the system. There'll be rising unrest. And it's into that environment that you're going to have the coming of the United States, other Westerners, and of course Japan. They step into that environment with new ideas, just as some Koreans are saying, hey, we would like some new ideas. Now, before that happens, there is going to be a group of people in Korea who are interested in reform, right? Who are interested in changing things. And starting in the 17th century, Koreans will start learning about Catholicism because there's Catholic missionaries in China. The Catholic missionaries in China working with Chinese will write books in Chinese that the Koreans can read, right? If you're an educated Korean, you can read Chinese no problem because that's what you write in, that's what you learn, that's how you study Confucianism. And in 1784, what happened was when the Koreans were sending a tribute mission to China, one of the members of that tribute mission found a Western missionary and got baptized. And then he came back to Korea and started baptizing a lot of other people. And eventually, it's kind of a fascinating story. This is what I specialize in. But this Chinese priest will come to Korea in 1794, and there will already be several thousand Korean Catholics there when he arrives, meaning that, there started being Korean Christians before any missionaries showed up, which is kind of interesting. But in any case, these Koreans in this time of feeling that things are in decline, that there are problems, their hope is that Catholicism will make them better Confucians, that God's grace will help them be better people and live out Confucian morality, that will help the country deal with the problems they face, and also that it will help them go to heaven. And I focused on these feelings of decline around this idea of strong kings, but it's also important to note that in the 18th and 19th century in Korea, population was going up. And what happened was they got to this kind of ideal point for epidemic diseases. So population would go up and there'd be an epidemic disease that would kill a huge amount of people. And then the population would go down and then grow again. There'd be a huge epidemic disease. So Koreans were having to deal more with mass death. And that seems to have been one reason why there were feelings of decline. It wasn't just political. And that's one reason why people became more interested in Catholicism, because that's a very well-developed idea of the afterlife. And in fact, some of the earliest conversations that we have on record about Koreans seriously considering becoming Catholics was in relationship to one of their sisters dying, right? There was this group of Korean scholars who got together because one of their sisters died, and that led them to start talking more about Catholicism. So Catholicism will spread in Korea, and there's this hope that it will lead to reform, lead to positive change. However, the Korean government will persecute it, both because they're afraid that it could lead to rebellion. China has a history of religiously inspired rebellions, and the Koreans didn't want that breaking out in Korea. The Catholics didn't want to rebel, but the Korean government didn't want to take a chance. But also there were fears of foreign influence, right? Catholicism was a foreign religion. It was governed by this guy called the Pope who lived far away, and Catholics were emphasizing their loyalty to this faraway Pope. To the Korean king, that led to fears that there was going to be this kind of foreign influence on Korea that would challenge Confucianism. And Korean Catholics did not perform, for example, ancestor rites because they saw it as a kind of idolatry that challenged Confucianism. But there was also a fear that they could help lead a foreign invasion. So the Korean government will actually persecute Catholics. And this is one thing we have to understand, because when the Protestant missionaries show up, and we'll focus a lot more on Protestants in this class than Catholics because the Catholic missionaries were usually not American. The Protestant missionaries were. They have to figure out how to come into a country in which Christianity has been persecuted, right, and is seen as bad. Now, Korea did have one regent who really was a strong regent who ruled, or helped, I should say, helped the king rule to help Korea as a country, right, who actually was concerned about the common people, who was concerned about the growing strength of the Yongbon. And that man is referred to in history as the One Goon, which basically means something like the Grand Prince. Now, it's a little complex, and I won't go into why this was the case, but he was the regent for his own son, right? He was the regent for his own son, Kojong, who would eventually become king. Now that's a little complex. You may say, well, why didn't he just become king himself? Right? Wasn't the One Goon just king? And it has to do with the complex rules of Chosun Dynasty succession and the complex court politics. And I would have to do a whole lecture on that to explain why this happens. So please just accept that kind of weird situation where you have the king's father acting as his own regent rather than being king himself. But he will serve as regent from 1863 to 1873. And he's going to try and deal with these feelings of decline, this problem of the Yongbon gaining too much power, by weakening the Yongbon, strengthening the monarchy, and trying to take care of the common people. And he's very successful in this. However, what's particularly important for us is that you've got this guy who's a strong ruler who believes that the way to maintain stability in Korea is to avoid foreign contact, right? To avoid foreign contact. Now, I haven't talked a lot about China in this class, in this lecture, because this is about Korea. But what they want to emphasize is the Koreans stayed in contact with the Chinese. They knew what was going on in China. They knew that Western imperialism was becoming increasingly strong in China. They knew that China had been defeated, for example, by the British in the Opium Wars that took place in the late 1830s, early 1840s. And the Daewongun was convinced that the reason that had happened was that the Chinese had let foreigners in the first place. So he was like, no foreigners. We're not going to have any of them. And anytime anyone tried to come and talk to the Koreans about opening trade or something like that, the Koreans would say, nope, don't want to do it, and would actually fight back violently if people pushed the case, right? And so the Daewongun is going to have this sense that the foreign is bad. We want to stay out of that. And that's going to last from 1863 to 1873, which is exactly when the Americans are going to start trying to push into Korea.